They said I was crazy. The meteorologists, the aviation authorities, the storm chasers who'd spent decades dancing around the edges of nature's fury, they all said the same thing. Dr. Elena Vasquez, you cannot fly through the eye of a Category 5 hurricane and survive. But here I am, writing this from a hospital bed in Miami, my left arm in a cast and my right hand trembling as I grip this pen. Not from fear, never from fear, but from the aftershocks of proving them all wrong. The doctors say it's just nerve damage from the pressure changes. I know better. It's the echo of touching something divine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Vasquez, and 6 days ago, I did what every expert in atmospheric science said was impossible. I flew a single-engine aircraft directly through the eye of Hurricane Magdalena. A storm so violent it rewrote the textbooks on what nature could unleash. But this story doesn't begin with that flight. It begins 3 years ago, in a cramped laboratory at the University of Colorado, where my obsession was born. I was 34 then, a theoretical meteorologist with a reputation for pursuing dangerous ideas. My colleagues called me brilliant but reckless, a woman who asked questions that made department heads nervous. While other researchers studied hurricanes from satellite imagery and computer models, I wanted to understand them from the inside. I wanted to know what it felt like to stand in the calm heart of chaos. The laboratory smelled of burnt coffee and electronic equipment that day when I first saw the data that would change everything. Hurricane Patricia, a monster storm that had formed in the Pacific 3 months earlier, had exhibited something unprecedented. For exactly 17 minutes, its eye wall had collapsed inward, creating a phenomenon my instruments couldn't explain. The pressure readings didn't make sense. The wind measurements defied everything we knew about atmospheric physics. It's probably equipment malfunction, said Dr. Marcus Chen, my research partner and the closest thing I had to a friend in the academic world. Marcus was cautious where I was bold, methodical where I was intuitive. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and always carried a thermos of green tea, as if caffeine might somehow contaminate his careful observations. Look at the symmetry, Marcus. I spread the printouts across our shared desk, pointing to the spiral patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. This isn't random. There's an intelligence to it, a structure we've never documented. He leaned over my shoulder, his breath smelling of mint and skepticism. Elena, storms don't have intelligence. They're chaotic systems governed by thermodynamics and what if they're not? I interrupted, feeling that familiar surge of excitement that came when I glimpsed something beyond conventional understanding. What if there's an organizing principle we've missed? What if the eye isn't just empty space but something more? Marcus straightened, removing his glasses to clean them, his tell when he thought I was venturing too far into theoretical territory. Even if you're right, how would we prove it? We can't exactly take measurements from inside a hurricane. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's when the idea hit me. It came not as a gradual realization but as a lightning strike of certainty that made my hands shake and my heart race. We fly into it. We what? We fly into the eye. Not around it, not through the outer bands, directly through the center. During that collapse phase, when the dynamics change. Marcus stared at me as if I'd suggested we vacation on the surface of the sun. Elena, that's not research. That's suicide. But I was already lost in the possibilities. I could see it in my mind, a small, agile aircraft equipped with specialized instruments, diving through the eye wall at the exact moment of collapse, measuring what no human had ever measured before. The National Hurricane Center had protocols against such flights. The military wouldn't risk their aircraft. But a civilian researcher with the right equipment and enough determination, think about it, I pressed, my voice rising with enthusiasm. Every major breakthrough in science has required someone willing to go where others wouldn't. We could revolutionize hurricane prediction, save thousands of lives. Or die trying. Marcus packed away his papers with deliberate slowness. Elena, I've worked with you for 3 years. I've seen you chase tornadoes in Kansas and fly into thunderstorms over Nebraska. This is different. This is beyond dangerous, it's impossible. That word. Impossible. It followed me home that night, echoing in my empty apartment as I stared at weather maps on my laptop screen. Hurricane season was still months away, but I found myself studying the projected paths, imagining the perfect storm that would give me the opportunity one needed. My apartment reflected my solitary obsession, walls covered with atmospheric charts, bookshelves loaded with meteorology journals, and a telescope on the balcony that I used more for watching storms than stars. I lived alone by choice, having learned early in my career that relationships suffered when your work involved chasing deadly weather patterns across the continent. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother in Phoenix. Mija, when are you coming to visit? Your father keeps asking when you'll settle down and give us grandchildren. I smiled despite myself. My parents, both high school teachers, had never understood my fascination with extreme weather. They worried constantly, especially after that near miss with a tornado in Oklahoma 2 years ago that left me with a scar across my forehead and a deeper respect for nature's power. I typed back, soon, Mom. Working on something important right now. But as I sent the message, I wondered if I'd ever see them again. Because deep in my heart, I knew Marcus was wrong about one thing. This wasn't impossible, it was inevitable. The storm was coming, and I was going to meet it head-on. 3 weeks later, Dr. Harrison Webb arrived at our university as a visiting professor from MIT. Webb was a legend in atmospheric physics, a man who'd spent 40 years studying severe weather and had written the definitive textbook on hurricane dynamics. He was also, according to departmental gossip, looking for a new research project after his recent divorce. I found him in the faculty lounge on his second day, a tall man with silver hair and intelligent brown eyes, reading a journal article while nursing what appeared to be his fourth cup of coffee. Dr. Webb? I approached with the confidence that had served me well in academic circles. I'm Elena Vasquez. I wondered if I could discuss some research ideas with you. He looked up, and I caught something in his expression, not dismissal, but evaluation. The tornado chaser, he said. I've read your papers on mesocyclone formation. Interesting work. Thank you. I was hoping to show you some data that might interest you. I sat down across from him, pulling out the Hurricane Patricia measurements I'd been carrying everywhere for weeks. Webb examined the printouts with the methodical attention of a man who'd seen thousands of similar charts. But gradually, his expression changed. His eyes narrowed, then widened. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. Where did you get this data? Pacific Hurricane Patricia, 3 months ago. We caught something during an eyewall replacement cycle that doesn't fit any existing models. This pressure differential. He traced one of the lines with his finger. This is impossible. There was that word again. But this time, I heard something different in its delivery, not dismissal, but wonder. That's what my colleagues keep telling me. But the data doesn't lie. Webb studied the charts for another 10 minutes, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or confusion. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I recognized from my own mirror, the look of someone who'd glimpsed a mystery too compelling to ignore. What do you think caused this anomaly? I took a deep breath. I think there's a structural component to hurricane eyes that we've never understood. Something that creates brief windows of stability during what should be the most chaotic moments. And how would you propose to study this phenomenon? Here it was. The moment of truth. Direct observation. From inside the eye during a collapse event. Webb's reaction wasn't the immediate rejection I'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring at me with the intensity of a chess player contemplating an unexpected move. You're talking about flying into a Category 5 hurricane. Yes. At its most unstable moment. Yes. In what kind of aircraft? My heart leaped. He wasn't saying no. Modified P-51 Mustang. World War II fighter, but updated with modern avionics and specialized atmospheric sensors. Fast enough to penetrate the eye wall, maneuverable enough to handle the turbulence, and historically proven to survive extreme conditions. And where would you acquire such an aircraft? I hesitated. This was where my plan moved from theoretical to deeply personal. My grandfather, Carlos Vasquez, flew P-51s in the Pacific Theater. Before he died, he left me his restored 1944 Mustang. It's been in storage for 5 years, but it's airworthy. Webb nodded slowly. And you're qualified to pilot such an aircraft? In extreme weather conditions? I've held an instrument rating for 8 years. I'm certified for aerobatic flight and have over 1,000 hours in high-performance aircraft. My grandfather taught me to fly before I could legally drive. That doesn't answer my question. I met his gaze directly. Dr. Webb, I've flown into the edges of hurricanes 14 times. I've penetrated tornado-producing supercells across 7 states. I understand the risks, but I also understand that some knowledge can only be gained through direct experience. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost see him weighing the scientific possibilities against the human costs. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. If, and I'm speaking purely hypothetically, if such a mission were to be attempted, it would require extensive preparation. Weather routing, equipment modification, emergency protocols. It would take months of planning. I know. And even then, the survival probability would be low, I finished. But not zero. Webb gathered up the printouts and handed them back to me. Dr. Vasquez, I'm going to give you some advice that might save your life. Forget about this. There are safer ways to study hurricanes, ways that don't involve risking everything on a theory that might be completely wrong. I stood to leave, disappointment settling in my chest like a cold weight. But as I reached the door, Webb spoke again. However, he said, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. If you were determined to pursue this course of action despite all rational advice, you might find it helpful to know that hurricane season begins in 6 months. And the long-range forecasts suggest it's going to be unusually active. I turned back to him, hardly daring to hope. Purely hypothetical, you understand, he continued, not meeting my eyes. But if someone were planning such a mission, they might want to begin with aircraft modifications. The avionics alone would take months to properly install and test. My heart hammered against my ribs. Hypothetically. He picked up his journal again, but I caught the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. There's a hangar at Jefferson County Airport where such work might be done privately. Hangar 47. The owner is an old friend who asks few questions about unusual projects. As I left the faculty lounge, my hands were shaking with excitement and terror in equal measure. Dr. Harrison Webb, the most respected hurricane researcher in the country, had just given me the roadmap to attempt the impossible, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was also being given the tools to destroy myself. That evening, I drove to the storage facility outside Boulder where my grandfather's P-51 Mustang had sat untouched for 5 years. The hangar smelled of old oil and memories as I pulled away the canvas covering. She was beautiful, sleek silver aluminum with faded blue nose art depicting a lightning bolt piercing a storm cloud. My grandfather had named her Cielo Azul, blue sky, after the clear weather he dreamed of during the darkest days of World War II. I ran my hand along her wing, feeling the solid craftsmanship of an era when aircraft were built to survive anything the world could throw at them. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, Elena, this airplane has seen combat over the Pacific, hurricanes in the Caribbean, and thunderstorms that would terrify modern pilots. She survived because she was built by people who understood that sometimes you have to fly through hell to reach heaven. Standing there in that dusty hangar, surrounded by the ghosts of family history and the weight of scientific obsession, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to fly through hell, and I was going to find out what waited on the other side. 6 months later, Hurricane Magdalena was bearing down on the Gulf Coast like nature's own apocalypse. The National Weather Service had upgraded her to Category 5 status, winds exceeding 180 miles per hour, pressure dropping to levels that made veteran meteorologists nervous. She was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Elena, please reconsider this madness. Dr. Webb stood beside my modified P-51 in Hangar 47, his face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there when we'd first discussed my theory. Behind him, the Mustang gleamed under the fluorescent lights, transformed from a museum piece into a flying laboratory bristling with atmospheric sensors, pressure gauges, and recording equipment. The window is perfect, I said, running my final equipment checks. Magdalena's eye wall is showing the exact instability patterns we predicted. If the collapse happens at 2:47 p.m., I'll have a 17-minute window to collect data that could revolutionize how we understand these storms. Or 17 minutes to die in the most spectacular way possible. Marcus had driven down from Colorado to make one last attempt at talking sense into me. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. Elena, I've run the calculations. The G-forces alone during eyewall penetration could knock you unconscious. And that's assuming the aircraft doesn't break apart. I pulled on my grandfather's leather flight jacket, feeling the weight of his wings pinned to the chest. Carlos flew through typhoons in the Pacific. This plane was built for extreme conditions. Not these extreme, Webb interjected. Elena, I've spent the last 6 months hoping you'd come to your senses. What you're proposing goes beyond scientific inquiry, it's suicide dressed up as research. But I was already climbing into the cockpit, my hands moving through the pre-flight sequence my grandfather had drilled into me since childhood. Every switch, every gauge held memories of training flights where he'd taught me that fear was just another instrument to read and manage. Dr. Vasquez. The voice came from behind me. I turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching the aircraft, her press credentials clearly visible. I'm Janet Morrison from Storm Watch Network. I understand you're about to attempt something unprecedented. No interviews, I called down, but she persisted. The scientific community is calling this a publicity stunt. How do you respond to critics who say you're risking your life for personal glory rather than legitimate research? I paused in my checklist, anger flaring in my chest. For 6 months, I'd endured exactly this kind of dismissal. The university had threatened to revoke my research position. The Federal Aviation Administration had tried to ground my flight plan. 3 major meteorology journals had rejected my preliminary papers without peer review, citing ethical concerns about methodology. Miss Morrison, I said, meeting her eyes directly, in 1947, Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier because everyone said it was impossible. In 1969, we landed on the moon because dreamers refused to accept limitations. Today, I'm going to fly through a hurricane because science demands that someone ask the hard questions. But at what cost? I thought of my parents, who'd driven through the night from Phoenix to beg me not to go. I thought of my grandfather, who'd risked everything, flying through enemy fire over the Pacific. I thought of all the coastal communities that could be saved if we truly understood how hurricanes worked. At whatever cost is necessary. The engine roared to life, drowning out any further protests. As I taxied toward the runway, I caught sight of Webb and Marcus standing together, 2 brilliant men united in their certainty that I was about to die for nothing. Maybe they were right. But as I lifted off into skies already darkening with Magdalena's outer bands, I felt something I'd never experienced before, absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The flight to Magdalena's I took 43 minutes of the most terrifying aviation I'd ever experienced. The outer bands hit like invisible hammers, slamming the Mustang up and down in thermals that tested every rivet in her aluminum skin. Rain struck the windscreen with the force of bullets, and lightning crackled close enough to illuminate the cockpit, but the Mustang held together, just as my grandfather had promised she would. And as I penetrated deeper into the storm, something extraordinary began to happen. The atmospheric readings on my instruments started showing patterns that defied everything I'd learned about hurricane dynamics. The pressure wasn't dropping chaotically, it was oscillating in precise mathematical intervals, like a vast atmospheric heartbeat. The wind speeds formed spirals within spirals, fractals of motion that suggested an underlying order to the chaos. "This is impossible," I whispered, watching the data stream across my displays. But the evidence was undeniable. Magdalena wasn't just a storm, she was an organized system of incredible complexity, following rules we'd never discovered because we'd never been close enough to observe them. And then I saw it, the eye wall rising before me like a cathedral of clouds. The eye wall stretched from sea level to the edge of space, a perfect cylinder of rotating winds that reached speeds I couldn't accurately measure. At its center, barely visible through the mist and spray, was the eye itself, not the empty void I'd expected, but something that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. I checked my chronometer, 2:44 p.m. 3 minutes until the predicted collapse. Taking a deep breath that might be my last, I pushed the throttle forward and dove into the eye wall. The world disappeared, sound, sight, sensation, everything vanished into a maelstrom of pure force that grabbed the Mustang and flung her through dimensions of turbulence I hadn't known existed. The G-forces slammed me back and forth in my harness, my vision graying at the edges as the aircraft bucked and rolled through air that moved like liquid concrete. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, "When you can't see where you're going, trust your instruments." When your instruments fail, trust the airplane. When the airplane fails, trust yourself. The instruments were screaming warnings I couldn't read through the violent shaking. The airplane was being torn apart by forces that should have destroyed her. But somehow, impossibly, we kept flying, and then, suddenly, we broke through the eye of Hurricane Magdalena was unlike anything I could have imagined. Not empty space, but a vast cathedral of calm stretching 30 miles across, with walls of cloud rising beyond visual range. The air here was perfectly still, almost crystalline in its clarity. Sunlight streamed down from above, creating an otherworldly twilight that turned everything silver and gold, but it was the center that took my breath away. There, suspended in the exact middle of the eye, was a structure I had no words to describe. Not solid, not gas, but something between, a spiral of light and energy that pulsed with the rhythm I detected on my instruments. It was beautiful beyond comprehension, and terrifying in its alien perfection. I flew closer, my scientific training overriding the primal fear that screamed at me to flee. The readings on my instruments went wild as I approached, measuring energy patterns that didn't correspond to any known atmospheric phenomena. Whatever this was, it was the source of the hurricane's incredible organization, the hidden engine that drove storms like Magdalena beyond the normal laws of weather. At 2:47 p.m. exactly, it began. The spiral structure started to collapse inward, folding into itself like origami made of lightning. The eye wall shuddered, and I felt the first tremors of the reorganization I'd predicted. But I also felt something else, a presence, vast and ancient, that seemed to recognize my intrusion. For 17 minutes, I flew through conditions that redefined my understanding of what was possible. I recorded pressure variations that would take years to fully analyze. I documented wind patterns that suggested hurricanes weren't just weather phenomena but something far more complex. And I witnessed the birth of new atmospheric dynamics as Magdalena reorganized herself around her mysterious core. When the eye wall began to stabilize, I knew my window was closing. Fighting against every instinct that screamed at me to stay and learn more, I turned the Mustang toward what I hoped was still a path out of the storm. The exit was even more violent than the entry. The reorganized eye wall hit the aircraft with renewed fury, as if the storm were angry at my intrusion. Systems failed throughout the cockpit. Hydraulics, electrical, navigation, everything except the engine that my grandfather had rebuilt with his own hands decades ago. I flew by instinct and memory, navigating through turbulence that would have killed a lesser aircraft. When I finally broke free of Magdalena's outer bands, both the Mustang and I were barely holding together. The emergency landing at a small airfield in Louisiana was more controlled crash than proper touchdown. The aircraft's landing gear collapsed on impact, sending us skidding across wet tarmac in a shower of sparks. When the Mustang finally came to rest, I sat in the cockpit for several minutes, hardly believing I was still alive. The data I'd collected would revolutionize hurricane science. The 17 minutes of recordings from inside Magdalena's eye would lead to prediction models that could save thousands of lives. Universities would compete to offer me research positions. The scientific community that had dismissed me as reckless would hail me as a visionary. But as I climbed out of my grandfather's battered aircraft, what I remembered most wasn't the vindication or the scientific triumph. It was that moment of connection with something vast and unknowable, the instant when I'd touched the beating heart of the storm and felt it recognize me in return. 3 weeks later, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Hurricane Conference, presenting data that would rewrite textbooks on storm dynamics. The applause was thunderous, the offers overwhelming. But I found myself thinking about my grandfather, who'd flown through his own impossible storms and lived to tell the tale. After the presentation, Dr. Webb approached me with an expression of grudging admiration. "Elena, what you accomplished was..." He paused, searching for words. "It was either the most brilliant scientific achievement of our generation or the luckiest stupidity in recorded history." I smiled, feeling the weight of my grandfather's wings still pinned to my jacket. Maybe it was both. "So what's next? Book deals? Documentary films? Every research institution in the country wants to hire you." I looked out the conference center windows, where storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Somewhere out there, another hurricane was forming, another mystery waiting to be solved. "I'm going flying," I said simply. Dr. Webb shook his head with the exasperated affection of a mentor who'd watched his student achieve the impossible. "Elena Vasquez, you are absolutely insane. That's what they said about my grandfather. That's what they said about every pilot who pushed beyond what experts thought was possible. I gathered my research papers, data that would change how humanity understood the power of storms. But here's what I learned flying through Magdalena's eye: the experts are usually wrong about what's impossible. They're only right about what's never been tried. As I walked out of the conference center, my phone buzzed with a weather alert. Hurricane season was far from over, and the next storm was already spinning up in the Atlantic. The experts were calling it unprecedented, impossible to predict. I couldn't wait to prove them wrong again. 6 months later, the data from my flight through Hurricane Magdalena had revolutionized storm prediction, leading to early warning systems that saved over 3,000 lives during the next hurricane season. The mysterious energy patterns I'd documented were still being studied by atmospheric physicists around the world, suggesting new frontiers in weather science that we were only beginning to understand. But the most important discovery wasn't in my published papers or award speeches. It was the knowledge that impossibility is just another word for untested possibility, and that sometimes the most important scientific breakthroughs come not from playing it safe, but from flying directly into the heart of the storm. My grandfather would have been proud. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.